Madame Vivienne's wedding dresses were the most beautiful in the kingdom, but brides who wore her creations would disappear on their wedding day. The curse hidden among silk and lace would turn the happiest day into the most terrifying nightmare. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background. And let's begin our journey together tonight. The narrow cobblestone street that wound through London's most fashionable district held secrets that even the most discerning society ladies could never have imagined. Behind the elegant facade of Moonlight Atelier, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across bolts of the finest silk and imported lace, Madame Vivienne Blackthorne worked magic that transcended the ordinary boundaries of needlework and thread. At 38, Vivienne possessed a beauty that seemed untouched by time, her raven black hair always arranged in an elaborate coiffure that showcased her graceful neck, while her emerald eyes held depths that suggested knowledge of arts far beyond mere dressmaking. Her fingers moved across fabric with the precision of a surgeon and the grace of a pianist, creating gowns that seemed to capture moonlight in their very weave. The atelier itself had been designed to inspire dreams in every bride who crossed its threshold. Mirrors lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their ornate silver frames reflecting not just the viewer's image, but somehow enhancing it, making every woman appear more radiant, more beautiful than she had ever imagined possible. Mannequins displayed creations that seemed too perfect for mortal wear, each dress a masterpiece of artistry that promised to transform its wearer into something approaching divine. But it was Vivienne's reputation that truly set her apart from every other dressmaker in the kingdom. Her wedding gowns were not merely clothing, they were works of art that seemed to possess their own inner life, fabrics that moved with supernatural grace, beadwork that caught light in ways that defied optical explanation, and silhouettes that enhanced natural beauty while concealing every flaw. The waiting list for a Vivienne Blackthorne original extended months into the future, with wealthy families willing to pay extraordinary sums for the privilege of having their daughters married in gowns that would be remembered and envied for generations. Each creation was unique, designed specifically for its intended wearer, with consultations that could extend over weeks, as Vivienne studied her clients' personalities, complexions, and dreams to create garments that seemed to have been crafted by fairy godmothers. Lady Catherine Pemberton had been among the most eager clients ever to enter Moonlight Atelier, her upcoming marriage to the Duke of Ashworth representing the social triumph of the season. At 19, she possessed the kind of fresh beauty that required no artificial enhancement, yet her family's ambitions demanded a wedding dress that would establish her as the new standard for aristocratic elegance. The consultation process with Vivienne had been unlike anything Catherine had experienced. The seamstress had studied her with an intensity that bordered on unsettling, taking measurements that seemed to map not just her physical dimensions, but some deeper essence of her being. The questions Vivienne asked went far beyond matters of style and fit, exploring Catherine's dreams for married life, her deepest hopes and fears, and her understanding of what it meant to surrender one's independence for love. The design that emerged from these sessions had been breathtaking in its beauty and complexity. Vivienne had proposed a gown that would incorporate threads of silver spun so fine they seemed like captured moonbeams, pearls that had been cultivated in waters that appeared on no map, and lace that had been woven according to patterns that predated written history. The creation would require months of work, with each element crafted by hand, using techniques that Vivienne claimed had been passed down through generations of women who understood the true art of making dreams tangible. The fittings that followed had been ceremonies in themselves, with Catherine standing for hours as Vivienne made adjustments, so minute they were barely perceptible to the naked eye. Each session revealed new details of the dress's construction. Embroidery that seemed to shift and change in different lights, beadwork that created patterns visible only from certain angles, and a train that moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Catherine's excitement about her wedding had grown with each fitting. As Vivienne's creation exceeded even her most ambitious fantasies, the dress seemed to transform her into someone who belonged in fairy tales rather than ordinary life, while the seamstress's quiet confidence assured her that her wedding would be remembered as the most beautiful ceremony anyone had ever witnessed. The morning of Catherine's wedding had dawned clear and bright, with spring sunlight streaming through the windows of her family's estate, where final preparations were being made. The wedding dress hung in her chambers like a captured dream, its fabric seeming to glow with its own inner radiance. Every detail was perfect, from the tiny seed pearls that traced delicate patterns across the bodice to the ethereal veil that seemed woven from morning mist itself. Catherine's joy as she prepared for the ceremony had been infectious, her happiness radiating through the household as servants made final arrangements and family members arrived to witness her transformation from Miss Pemberton to the Duchess of Ashworth. The dress fit her like a second skin, enhancing her natural beauty while making her appear almost supernatural in her perfection. But as the wedding hour approached, something began to change in Catherine's demeanor. The radiant joy that had characterized her morning preparations gradually gave way to a dreamy detachment that her bridesmaids initially attributed to pre-wedding nerves. Her responses to their excited chatter became increasingly vague, while her eyes took on a distant quality that suggested her attention was focused on something invisible to everyone else. The procession to the church had proceeded according to plan, with Catherine appearing every inch the perfect bride as she took her father's arm for the walk down the aisle. The assembled congregation gasped in admiration at the sight of Vivienne's masterpiece, while the Duke of Ashworth's expression of wonder confirmed that the dress had achieved everything that Catherine's family had hoped for in terms of making an unforgettable impression. Yet something indefinable seemed wrong to those who observed Catherine most closely. Her movements had taken on a mechanical quality that contrasted strangely with the ethereal beauty of her appearance, while her smile, though perfectly appropriate, seemed somehow empty of the joy that should have illuminated such a moment. She responded to the ceremony's familiar words with correct timing, but without the emotional engagement that such momentous promises should have evoked. The moment of crisis came as the ceremony reached its climax. When Catherine was asked to speak her wedding vows, she opened her mouth to respond to the Archbishop's prompt, but instead of the traditional words of commitment, she began to speak in a voice that was recognizably hers, yet somehow different, older, sadder, filled with knowledge that no 19-year-old should possess. "I cannot," she said, her words carrying clearly through the hushed church. "I cannot bind myself to promises that will be forgotten, to love that will fade, to happiness that turns to sorrow. I have seen what becomes of brides who trust in forever, and I will not become another victim of such beautiful lies." The congregation stirred uneasily as Catherine's voice took on an increasingly distant quality, as if she were speaking from some realm far removed from the physical church where they had gathered. Her wedding dress seemed to shimmer more brightly as she spoke, the fabric appearing to move with its own purpose while the pearls and embroidery caught light in patterns that created strange shadows across her face. Before anyone could respond to her unexpected declaration, Catherine began to fade, not disappearing in some dramatic supernatural display, but simply becoming less substantial, as if she were made of morning mist that was gradually dispersing in the warming air. Her voice continued speaking words that no one present could later remember clearly, while her image became increasingly transparent until she was nothing more than a shimmer in the air, where a bride had stood moments before. The Duke of Ashworth's cry of anguish filled the church as he reached toward the space where his bride had been, his hands grasping nothing but empty air. Catherine's wedding dress had vanished with her, leaving no trace except the memory of impossible beauty and the lingering scent of flowers that bloomed nowhere in England. The investigation that followed Catherine's disappearance had been thorough but ultimately fruitless. The church was searched from crypt to bell tower, while the surrounding grounds were examined by teams of investigators who found no clue that might explain what had happened to the missing bride. The wedding dress, which had represented months of Vivienne's work and thousands of pounds in materials, had vanished as completely as its wearer. Madame Vivienne had expressed appropriate shock and sorrow when informed of Catherine's mysterious disappearance, though she had seemed less surprised than others might have expected. Her explanation for the tragedy had focused on the enormous stress that modern brides faced, suggesting that Catherine might have suffered some form of nervous breakdown brought on by the pressure of such a public ceremony and the magnitude of the commitments involved. The seamstress had offered to provide another wedding dress should Catherine be found and the ceremony rescheduled, though she had mentioned that replacing such a unique creation would require starting the entire design process over again. Her generosity in making such an offer had enhanced her reputation for caring about her clients' welfare beyond mere commercial considerations. As weeks passed without any trace of the missing bride, society's attention had gradually shifted from the mystery of her disappearance to speculation about whether such tragedies might befall other brides whose expectations exceeded the realities that marriage could provide. The origins of Vivienne's transformation from celebrated seamstress to architect of supernatural disappearances could be traced to the bitter winter of 1834, when her own dreams of marital happiness had been shattered by betrayals that would have broken a lesser woman entirely. At 25, she had been the most sought-after dressmaker in London, her talent for creating breathtaking gowns matched only by her own stunning beauty and the genuine sweetness of temperament that made her beloved by clients and competitors alike. Her marriage to Lord Edmund Blackthorne had seemed like a fairy tale come true, the kind of romantic story that her clients dreamed of experiencing themselves. Edmund had been everything a woman could desire in a husband: handsome, wealthy, charming, and apparently devoted to his beautiful wife. Their wedding had been the social event of the season, with Vivienne wearing a creation of her own design that had established new standards for bridal elegance. The early months of their marriage had been blissful, with Edmund showering Vivienne with attention and gifts while encouraging her to continue her dressmaking career, despite her new elevated social position. He had taken pride in her artistic achievements, often boasting to friends about his talented wife while commissioning her to create gowns for his female relatives and social connections. But the happiness that had seemed so secure had begun to crumble when Vivienne discovered that Edmund's frequent business trips concealed a systematic pattern of infidelity that made a mockery of every promise he had made during their courtship. The evidence had accumulated gradually: letters from other women, jewelry that disappeared from her collection only to reappear adorning mysterious recipients, and most damaging of all, pregnancy announcements from women whose timing suggested that Edmund had been unfaithful within weeks of their wedding ceremony. The confrontation that followed Vivienne's discovery of Edmund's betrayals had revealed depths of cruelty that she could never have suspected in the man she had married. Rather than showing remorse for his behavior, he had laughed at her distress while explaining that her expectations of fidelity were naive and unrealistic. Marriage, he had informed her with casual brutality, was a business arrangement that provided social respectability and financial security, not a guarantee of exclusive romantic attention. Edmund's dismissal of her feelings had been accompanied by threats that made clear the precarious nature of her position. If she chose to make difficulties about his affairs, he could easily divorce her on grounds of mental instability, leaving her with nothing but the scandal that would destroy her reputation and her business. Alternatively, she could accept the realities of aristocratic marriage and continue enjoying the benefits of her elevated position, while ignoring inconvenient evidence of his activities. The choice between public humiliation and private suffering had seemed impossible, but Vivienne's decision had been made for her when she discovered the full extent of Edmund's systematic deception. He had not only been unfaithful, but had been using her own designs to create wedding dresses for the women he married in ceremonies that were legally meaningless but emotionally devastating to his victims. Her artistic creations were being perverted to facilitate the destruction of other women's dreams. The realization that her talent was being exploited to enable Edmund's cruelty had filled Vivienne with rage that transcended ordinary human emotion, becoming something that seemed to burn in her very soul. She had spent her career helping women realize their dreams of perfect weddings, only to discover that her own husband was using her skills to create elaborate deceptions that would leave his victims as broken and betrayed as she had been. It was in this state of consuming fury that Vivienne had first encountered the ancient texts that would reshape her understanding of what was possible through the careful application of needle, thread, and will. Hidden among the occult volumes that Edmund collected as fashionable curiosities were manuscripts that described the use of textile arts for purposes that conventional sewing could never achieve. The book that would change everything had been bound in leather that felt warm to the touch and written in script that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The seamstress's grimoire claimed to be the work of medieval craftswomen who had discovered that fabric could serve as a medium for capturing and directing spiritual energy, while embroidery patterns could function as complex magical formulae when executed with proper understanding and intent. The techniques described in the grimoire went far beyond mere superstition, presenting systematic methods for weaving spells into clothing that would influence the wearer's fate in ways that appeared entirely natural. Wedding dresses were particularly potent vehicles for such work, as they were worn during moments of intense emotional vulnerability when the subject's spiritual defenses were naturally lowered. Vivienne's first experiment with these forbidden techniques had been motivated by pure desperation rather than any systematic plan for revenge. Edmund had announced his intention to attend yet another of his mysterious business engagements, and she had decided to alter one of his shirts using methods described in the grimoire. The embroidery pattern she had selected was supposed to create compelling honesty in the wearer, forcing them to speak truthfully about subjects they would normally conceal. The results had exceeded her most optimistic hopes. During the dinner party that followed Edmund's return, he had begun speaking with unprecedented candor about his affairs, his contempt for his wife, and his plans for future conquests. The assembled guests had listened in growing horror as he detailed betrayals that destroyed reputations and revealed secrets that would have been better left hidden. By evening's end, his social position had been irreparably damaged, while Vivienne had gained invaluable insight into the true power of the techniques she had discovered. The success of this initial experiment had convinced Vivienne that the grimoire's methods could provide solutions to problems that conventional means could never address. Edmund's destruction would require more than simple embarrassment. It would demand the kind of poetic justice that only supernatural intervention could provide. The masterwork that would serve as both Edmund's punishment and Vivienne's introduction to the darker applications of her newfound abilities had been a waistcoat embroidered with patterns that the grimoire claimed would bind the wearer to experience the emotional pain they had inflicted on others. The design had required weeks of careful needlework, with each stitch placed according to precise specifications that would ensure maximum effectiveness. Edmund's reaction to wearing the cursed waistcoat had been immediate and devastating. Within hours, he had begun experiencing intense emotional anguish that seemed to come from nowhere, followed by physical symptoms that his physicians could neither explain nor treat. The pain that he suffered appeared to be connected to his memories of the women he had betrayed, as if he were experiencing their heartbreak as though it were his own. The progression of Edmund's decline had been swift and inexorable, with each day bringing new torments that seemed specifically designed to mirror the suffering he had caused others. His death, when it finally came, had been attributed to heart failure brought on by mysterious ailments that had baffled the kingdom's most skilled physicians. Vivienne had mourned him publicly with perfect propriety, while privately marveling at the precision with which supernatural justice had been administered. But Edmund's death had provided only temporary satisfaction, as Vivienne gradually understood that her husband's betrayals were merely symptoms of larger problems that affected countless women throughout society. The institution of marriage itself seemed designed to enable the exploitation of feminine dreams, with wedding ceremonies serving as elaborate deceptions that concealed the inevitable disappointments that would follow. The solution that occurred to Vivienne involved applying her newfound abilities on a much larger scale, using her position as London's premier wedding dress designer to address these systemic problems through methods that conventional reform could never achieve. If marriage was inherently corrupting to those who entered it with pure hearts, then perhaps she could protect other women by ensuring that their wedding dreams remained forever perfect, unmarred by the realities that would inevitably follow. The techniques that Vivienne developed for her protective wedding dresses drew upon the most advanced methods described in the seamstress's grimoire, combined with innovations of her own design that reflected years of experimentation and refinement. Each gown became a complex magical working that would activate during the wedding ceremony, transporting its wearer to a realm where dreams remained forever beautiful and love never faded. The early experiments had required careful testing to ensure that the transportation process was both humane and irreversible. Vivienne's first attempts had resulted in incomplete disappearances that left traces behind, but she had gradually perfected techniques that ensured complete removal of both bride and dress to whatever dimension served as their final destination. The realm that received her transported brides appeared to be a place where wedding days lasted forever, where love remained as perfect as it had seemed during courtship, and where the disappointments that inevitably followed marriage could never intrude upon eternal happiness. Vivienne could sense her former client's contentment through the mystical connections that linked her to her creations, confirming that her interventions were providing the protection she had intended. The transformation of Moonlight Atelier from a fashionable dress shop into a gateway for supernatural rescue operations had required establishing new relationships with suppliers who could provide materials that ordinary seamstresses would never require. The threads, fabrics, and embellishments that Vivienne now used came from sources that existed on the margins between the mundane and magical worlds, dealers who asked no questions about their customers' intended applications. As her techniques became more sophisticated, Vivienne had begun to understand that she was providing a service that went far beyond mere dressmaking. She was offering protection against the inevitable corruption that marriage brought to pure hearts, while ensuring that the most beautiful day of her clients' lives would remain forever unmarred by subsequent disillusionment. The perfect crime, Vivienne had realized, was one that appeared to be an act of mercy rather than an act of violence, where the victims were rescued rather than destroyed, and where their family's grief was tempered by the knowledge that their daughters had achieved the happiness that they had always dreamed of experiencing. The systematic expansion of Vivienne's rescue operations had required developing selection criteria that would identify brides whose situations most urgently demanded supernatural intervention. Through her extensive network of society contacts, seamstress gossip chains, and careful observation of engagement announcements, she had learned to recognize the warning signs that indicated when a wedding was likely to result in eventual heartbreak and disappointment. Lady Margaret Ashworth had presented the perfect combination of circumstances that made her an ideal candidate for Vivienne's protective services. At 21, she possessed both the radiant beauty and innocent romanticism that would make her eventual disillusionment particularly cruel, while her engagement to Lord Pemberton revealed troubling patterns that experienced observers could recognize as harbingers of future unhappiness. Lord Pemberton's reputation among those who knew him well included whispered accounts of gambling debts that had reached dangerous levels, along with rumors about his treatment of women that suggested character flaws that skilled social presentation could temporarily conceal, but never permanently reform. Margaret's family had been blinded by his title and apparent wealth, failing to investigate the financial realities that would make their daughter's married life far different from what her romantic expectations anticipated. The consultation process for Margaret's wedding dress had provided Vivienne with opportunities to confirm her assessment of the situation, while beginning the subtle psychological preparation that would ensure the eventual transportation occurred smoothly. Margaret's descriptions of her expectations for married life had revealed the kind of idealistic romanticism that reality would inevitably crush, while her obvious intelligence suggested that she would suffer particularly acutely when those expectations were disappointed. The design that Vivienne had created for Margaret's gown had been one of her most ambitious works yet, incorporating threads that had been spun from materials that existed only during certain phases of the moon, pearls that had been harvested from waters that reflected no earthly sky, and lace patterns that followed geometric principles discovered in manuscripts that predated recorded history. The construction had required months of careful work, with each element designed to serve both aesthetic and metaphysical purposes. Margaret's fittings had proceeded according to established patterns, with the bride-to-be growing increasingly excited about her upcoming wedding, while remaining oblivious to the true nature of the protection that was being prepared for her. Vivienne's gentle questions about her hopes and dreams had been presented as normal interest in client satisfaction, never revealing their actual purpose of fine-tuning the dimensional destination that would receive Margaret after her transportation. The wedding ceremony that would mark Margaret's disappearance had been held at Westminster Abbey, with the kingdom's most distinguished guests assembled to witness what society expected to be the wedding of the season. Margaret's appearance in Vivienne's creation had exceeded even the most optimistic expectations, with the gown seeming to transform her into something that belonged more in heaven than on earth. But as the ceremony had progressed, Those closest to Margaret had begun to notice the same dreamy detachment that had characterized Catherine Pemberton's final moments. Her responses to the familiar liturgy had become increasingly distant, while her expression had taken on the peaceful serenity of someone who was experiencing visions of perfect happiness that transcended the mundane reality of the church, where her physical form remained temporarily present. Margaret's disappearance had occurred during the exchange of wedding rings, as she had reached out to accept Lord Pemberton's offering only to have her hand pass through his like morning mist. Her final words had been spoken in a voice filled with gratitude rather than fear. "I can see it now. The place where love never dies and promises are never broken. Thank you for showing me that such perfection is possible." The investigation into Margaret's vanishing had been more thorough than what had followed Catherine's disappearance, as her family's political connections had ensured official attention that ordinary cases might not have received. But the complete absence of any physical evidence had made conventional detective work impossible, while the supernatural nature of what had occurred lay far beyond the investigative capabilities that existing authorities possessed. Duchess Eleanor Worthington's case had represented Vivienne's most challenging rescue operation yet, as her engagement to the Duke of Somerset involved political implications that extended far beyond personal happiness. Eleanor was being married to cement an alliance between powerful families whose combined influence would reshape parliamentary politics, making her individual welfare secondary to larger strategic considerations that treated her as a valuable but replaceable asset. The Duke himself had been selected for Eleanor not because of any compatibility with her temperament or interests, but because his military reputation and financial resources would enhance her family's position in ongoing power struggles that had little to do with romantic love. Eleanor's own preferences had been deemed irrelevant to decisions that would determine the course of her entire life, reducing her to the status of a particularly valuable breeding animal whose primary purpose was producing heirs to continue family dynasties. Vivienne's research into Eleanor's situation had revealed the full extent of the cruelty that was being perpetrated under the guise of advantageous marriage arrangements. The Duchess-to-be had been systematically isolated from friends who might have supported her emotional needs, while being subjected to training and duties that would make her an efficient manager of households and producer of children, but would provide no outlet for her considerable intellectual abilities or creative interests. The wedding dress that Vivienne had designed for Eleanor's rescue had been her most complex creation yet, incorporating protective elements that would need to function despite the intense scrutiny that such a high-profile ceremony would attract. The gown's magical properties had been woven so deeply into its fundamental structure that even careful examination by experts would reveal only evidence of extraordinary craftsmanship rather than supernatural intervention. Eleanor's transportation had been accomplished during the climactic moment when she was asked to pledge obedience to a man she barely knew in service of political arrangements she had played no role in creating. Her final visible act had been to smile with radiant joy as she spoke words that transformed the traditional marriage vows into something entirely different. "I pledge my heart to love that will never disappoint, my soul to happiness that will never fade, and my life to dreams that will never be corrupted by reality." The political crisis that had followed Eleanor's disappearance had required careful management to prevent the kind of investigation that might have uncovered evidence of supernatural intervention. Vivienne had worked through intermediaries to encourage theories that Eleanor had suffered a nervous breakdown brought on by the pressure of her approaching marriage, while providing subtle suggestions that she might have fled to distant relatives who would protect her privacy during her recovery. The success of these high-profile rescues had established Vivienne's reputation within certain circles as someone who possessed unusual abilities to predict and prevent wedding disasters. Families who had witnessed the mysterious disappearances began approaching her with requests for consultations that went beyond normal dressmaking services, seeking advice about whether their own planned marriages might be susceptible to similar tragic outcomes. These consultations had provided Vivienne with opportunities to expand her rescue operations while maintaining the appearance of conventional business activities. Brides whose situations demanded intervention could be identified during routine fittings, while those whose marriages showed promise of genuine happiness could be provided with beautiful but purely mundane wedding gowns that would serve traditional purposes without supernatural complications. The network of contacts that supported Vivienne's expanding operations had grown to include suppliers of exotic materials, scholars of obscure texts, and practitioners of related arts who remained ignorant of each other's roles while contributing to enterprises whose full scope none of them understood. This compartmentalization ensured operational security while providing resources that enabled increasingly sophisticated rescue missions. The invisible bridal collection that Vivienne had assembled through her rescue operations existed in a realm that she could access through meditation and ritual practices that allowed her to monitor the welfare of her transported clients. The reports she received from these mystical communications confirmed that the brides were experiencing the eternal happiness that she had promised, living in a dimension where wedding days never ended and romantic dreams never encountered disappointing realities. The financial success that accompanied Vivienne's expanding reputation had provided resources for establishing additional facilities that could serve the growing demand for her unique services. Moonlight Atelier had expanded into adjacent buildings, while subsidiary workshops had been established in other cities where talented seamstresses could be trained in modified versions of Vivienne's techniques that would extend her protective capabilities without revealing the full extent of her methods. The most sophisticated aspect of Vivienne's operation was its integration of supernatural rescue missions with genuine improvements to the institution of marriage itself. Families who had witnessed the mysterious disappearances had begun approaching the marriages of their remaining daughters with greater care and consideration, seeking to understand what factors might have contributed to the previous tragedies and taking steps to ensure that future unions would be based on compatibility and mutual respect rather than purely financial or political consideration. This indirect reform of marriage practices had pleased Vivienne as much as the direct rescue of individual brides, confirming that her work was having positive effects that extended far beyond her immediate clients. The fear of mysterious wedding day disappearances had created pressures for social change that conventional reform movements could never have achieved, while the beauty of her rescued bride's final moments had inspired romantic idealism that elevated expectations for what marriage should provide. As her third year of rescue operations concluded, Vivienne had come to understand that she had created something unprecedented in human history, a form of supernatural social work that used magical intervention to address systemic problems while providing individual solutions that transcended the limitations of mundane reality. Her bridal collection continued to grow, each new addition representing another young woman who had been saved from eventual heartbreak and disappointment. The perfect system that Vivienne had developed served multiple constituencies simultaneously. Brides received protection from marriages that would have destroyed their dreams. Families were spared the long-term embarrassment of unsuccessful unions, and society as a whole benefited from increased attention to the factors that contributed to successful marriages. Her work had proven that the most effective forms of social reform were those that appeared to address individual problems while actually reshaping entire cultural institutions. The first crack in Vivienne's carefully constructed facade had appeared when Clara Whitmore, a young seamstress whose exceptional talent had earned her a position as assistant designer at Moonlight Atelier, began to notice patterns in the workshop's operations that conventional explanations could not address. At 23, Clara possessed both the technical expertise to recognize unusual techniques and the investigative instincts necessary to pursue uncomfortable questions despite the personal risks that such curiosity might entail. Clara's concerns had initially focused on the exotic materials that Vivienne used for her most important commissions, fabrics that seemed to shift color in different lights, threads that felt warm to the touch despite being stored in cool conditions, and embellishments that appeared to move with their own purpose when observed peripherally. Her attempts to research these materials through normal supplier networks had yielded no information, suggesting sources that operated far outside conventional commercial channels. The breakthrough in Clara's investigation had come through careful observation of Vivienne's working methods during late-night sessions when the atelier was supposedly closed to outside observation. Hidden in the workshop's storage areas, Clara had witnessed rituals that bore no resemblance to normal dressmaking activities, involving incantations in languages she could not identify and procedures that seemed designed to invest garments with properties that textiles should not possess. Most disturbing had been Clara's discovery of the detailed records that Vivienne maintained regarding her transported clients, documentation that revealed the systematic nature of the disappearances while providing insights into the dimensional realm that served as their final destination. The meticulous notes described not only the technical aspects of each rescue operation, but also ongoing communications with the transported brides that confirmed their continued existence in conditions of eternal happiness. Clara's initial reaction to these discoveries had been a mixture of fascination and horror that made objective evaluation of the situation extremely difficult. The revelation that her respected employer was responsible for the mysterious disappearances that had captivated society's attention was shocking enough, but the evidence that these interventions were providing genuine benefits to the victims created moral complexities that conventional ethical frameworks could not address. The transported brides, according to Vivienne's records, were experiencing lives of perfect fulfillment in a realm where romantic dreams never encountered disappointing realities. Their wedding days continued eternally, their love remained as pure as it had been during courtship, and their happiness was unmarred by the countless small betrayals and compromises that inevitably corrupted mundane marriages. From their perspective, Vivienne's interventions represented salvation rather than kidnapping. Yet Clara's training in traditional moral principles made it impossible for her to accept that systematic deception and supernatural abduction could be justified regardless of their ultimate benefits to the victims. The families who mourned their missing daughters were experiencing genuine grief, while the social disruption caused by the mysterious disappearances was creating consequences that extended far beyond Vivienne's immediate intentions. The dilemma that Clara faced involved choosing between exposing operations that appeared to be genuinely beneficial to their direct victims while causing enormous pain to innocent family members, or maintaining silence about activities that violated fundamental principles of human autonomy and social order. Her decision to confront Vivienne directly, rather than seeking outside intervention, reflected both her personal loyalty to her employer and her hope that some compromise might be possible that would address the ethical problems without destroying the positive aspects of the rescue operations. The confrontation between Clara and Vivienne had taken place in the atelier's main workroom, surrounded by half-completed wedding gowns that represented dreams in various stages of realization. Clara's accusations had been delivered with the respectful directness of someone who sought understanding rather than mere denunciation, while her questions had demonstrated genuine intellectual curiosity about the technical aspects of Vivienne's supernatural techniques. Vivienne's response to Clara's investigation had been neither defensive nor apologetic, but rather reflected the calm confidence of someone who had long anticipated this moment and prepared comprehensive justifications for her activities. Her explanation of the rescue operations had been delivered with the same passionate conviction that characterized her discussions of conventional dressmaking, presenting supernatural intervention as a natural evolution of her commitment to protecting clients from disappointment and harm. The philosophical argument that Vivienne had developed to justify her actions drew upon both her personal experiences with marital betrayal and her broader observations of the systemic problems that affected women throughout Victorian society. Marriage, as currently practiced, was inherently corrupting to those who entered it with pure hearts and romantic expectations, while the legal and social structures that supported the institution made genuine reform impossible through conventional means. Her rescue operations, Vivienne had explained, provided solutions to problems that no amount of social activism or legal reform could address. The transported brides were protected from inevitable disappointment, while their families were spared the long-term embarrassment of failed marriages, and society as a whole benefited from increased attention to the factors that contributed to successful unions. Clara's attempts to argue for alternative approaches that might achieve similar benefits without resorting to supernatural intervention had been met with patient explanations of why conventional methods had proven inadequate to address the scope and complexity of the problems involved. Vivienne's years of experience had demonstrated that even the most well-intentioned marriages typically deteriorated into arrangements that bore little resemblance to the dreams that had originally inspired them. The turning point in their conversation had come when Vivienne had offered to demonstrate the transportation process by allowing Clara to communicate directly with some of her rescued clients, establishing mystical contact that would provide first-hand testimony about conditions in the dimensional realm that served as their destination. The prospect of speaking with supposedly dead or missing women had been too compelling for Clara to refuse, despite her growing awareness that such communication might compromise her ability to maintain objective judgment about the situation. The ritual that enabled contact with the transported brides had been conducted in Vivienne's private chambers, using apparatus that combined conventional seance techniques with methods drawn from the seamstress's grimoire that governed Clara's introduction to supernatural intervention. The voices that had spoken through the mystical connection had been unmistakably those of women whose disappearances had scandalized society, yet their messages had contained nothing but expressions of gratitude for their rescue and descriptions of happiness that exceeded anything they had experienced during their mundane lives. Catherine Pemberton's spirit had spoken of eternal wedding celebrations where every day brought new discoveries about the depths of perfect love, while Margaret Ashworth had described educational opportunities and creative fulfillment that would have been impossible within the constraints of conventional marriage. Most convincingly, Eleanor Worthington had expressed relief at escaping political arrangements that would have reduced her to the status of a valuable but replaceable asset in power games that had nothing to do with personal happiness. The cumulative effect of these communications had been to undermine Clara's moral objections, while creating new psychological bonds that aligned her sympathies with Vivienne's rescue operations. Hearing the transported brides describe their eternal happiness in their own voices had made opposition to such arrangements seem not only futile but actually cruel, as if Clara would be condemning them to return to lives that they now recognized as fundamentally inferior to their current existence. Yet even as Clara's intellectual opposition weakened, her emotional response to the situation became increasingly complex and troubled. The knowledge that her employer possessed the power to transport people to dimensional realms of eternal happiness created possibilities that both fascinated and terrified her. If Vivienne could rescue brides from disappointing marriages, what other applications might such abilities have? And what responsibilities did Clara bear now that she possessed knowledge of these capabilities? Vivienne's recognition of Clara's internal conflict had led to an offer that appeared to address all of her assistant's concerns while providing solutions to problems that Clara had never consciously acknowledged. Rather than exposing operations that were providing genuine benefits to their victims, Clara could join the rescue missions as a full partner, helping to identify brides who most urgently needed protection while contributing her considerable technical skills to improving the transportation process. The partnership that Vivienne proposed would involve training Clara in the advanced techniques described in the seamstress's grimoire, knowledge that would make her one of the most accomplished practitioners of supernatural textile arts in the kingdom. She would gain access to materials and methods that conventional dressmaking could never provide, while participating in work that transcended mere commercial activities to become a form of spiritual mission dedicated to protecting innocent dreams from inevitable corruption. Clara's acceptance of this partnership had been motivated by a combination of intellectual fascination, moral confusion, and genuine concern for the welfare of future brides who might benefit from their protective interventions. The alternative of exposing Vivienne's operations would destroy not only the rescue missions, but also the happiness of women who had already been transported to their eternal wedding celebrations, making such actions seem unconscionably cruel regardless of its technical legality. The training that Clara had received in supernatural dressmaking techniques had opened her understanding to possibilities that conventional education could never have revealed. The seamstress's grimoire contained knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries by women who had discovered that textile arts could serve as vehicles for manipulating the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. Needlework became a form of spellcasting, while fabric patterns could function as complex magical formulae when executed with proper understanding and intent. Clara's natural talent for conventional sewing had translated remarkably well to these supernatural applications, with her precise technique and artistic sensibilities enabling her to master advanced procedures that had taken Vivienne years to perfect. Her contributions to the rescue operations had immediately enhanced their effectiveness, while reducing the time required to prepare each transportation ritual. The first bride that Clara had personally rescued had been Lady Sarah Blackwood, whose engagement to a notorious rake had promised years of humiliation and heartbreak that would have destroyed both her happiness and her family's reputation. The wedding dress that Clara had designed for Sarah's protection had incorporated innovations that improved upon Vivienne's established methods, creating transportation effects that were even smoother and more complete than previous rescue operations had achieved. Sarah's disappearance during her wedding ceremony had followed the now familiar pattern, though observers had noted that her final moments had seemed even more peaceful and joyful than those of previous victims. Her last words had been directed toward Clara rather than the general assembly. "Thank you for showing me that dreams can be more real than reality, and that love can exist without disappointment." The success of Clara's first independent rescue operation had confirmed her full integration into Vivienne's organization, while demonstrating that the supernatural techniques could be taught to others who possessed appropriate talent and dedication. This realization had opened possibilities for expanding the rescue operations beyond what Vivienne could accomplish working alone, creating networks of trained practitioners who could protect brides throughout the kingdom. The establishment of subsidiary workshops in major cities had required careful selection of seamstresses whose personal circumstances made them suitable candidates for training in supernatural techniques. Women who had experienced their own disappointments in marriage or love were often most receptive to arguments about the need to protect others from similar suffering, while those whose conventional careers had been limited by gender discrimination were eager to embrace opportunities that offered genuine power and influence. Clara's role in recruiting and training these new practitioners had evolved into something approaching that of a missionary spreading gospel about the possibilities for transcending mundane limitations through supernatural intervention. Her enthusiasm for the rescue operations had been enhanced rather than diminished by direct participation, while her technical innovations had continued improving the effectiveness and safety of the transportation process. The network that had grown around Vivienne and Clara's original partnership had operated with the efficiency of a well-organized religious movement, though its activities remained carefully concealed from authorities who would not have understood the benevolent nature of their interventions. Each workshop maintained the appearance of conventional dressmaking businesses, while actually serving as centers for identifying and protecting brides whose marriages promised to result in eventual disappointment. The coordination of activities across multiple locations had been accomplished through coded correspondence and regular gatherings that provided opportunities for sharing technical innovations while maintaining the security necessary to protect ongoing operations. The practitioners who participated in these meetings had developed strong bonds of mutual support and shared purpose that transcended ordinary professional relationships, creating a sisterhood dedicated to protecting romantic dreams from the corrupting influence of reality. The most significant development in the network's operations had been the establishment of criteria for identifying marriages that showed promise of genuine happiness and should therefore be allowed to proceed without supernatural intervention. Not all engagements required rescue operations, and the ability to distinguish between relationships that needed protection and those that might actually fulfill their romantic promises had become crucial to maintaining the moral legitimacy of their activities. Clara's research into the factors that contributed to successful marriages had revealed patterns that enabled increasingly accurate predictions about which unions would prove durable and satisfying. Age compatibility, shared interests, genuine affection that had developed gradually rather than through sudden infatuation, and family backgrounds that suggested similar values and expectations all correlated with improved chances for long-term happiness. Brides whose engagements met these positive criteria were provided with beautiful but entirely mundane wedding gowns that served traditional purposes without supernatural complications, while receiving subtle guidance about maintaining the positive factors that had contributed to their favorable prospects. The network's ability to distinguish between those who needed rescue and those who might find genuine happiness had enhanced the precision of their interventions while reducing the number of families who experienced the grief of mysterious disappearances. The success of this more discriminating approach had convinced Clara that their operations were achieving the optimal balance between protecting those who truly needed intervention while allowing natural processes to continue for relationships that showed genuine promise. The rescue missions had become a form of supernatural quality control that ensured only the most disadvantageous marriages were prevented, while supporting unions that offered realistic possibilities for mutual satisfaction. As Clara's fifth year with the organization concluded, she had achieved a position of influence that rivaled Vivienne's own authority within the network of rescue operations. Her technical innovations had revolutionized their methods, while her training programs had created a new generation of practitioners whose skills exceeded even those of the original founder. Most importantly, her moral framework had provided philosophical justification for activities that might otherwise have seemed difficult to defend. The final fitting that would represent Clara's ultimate triumph had been scheduled for Lady Victoria Pemberton, whose engagement to a young man of excellent character and compatible temperament had initially suggested that no intervention would be necessary. However, Clara's investigation had revealed hidden factors that made rescue operations advisable despite the superficial promise of the relationship. Victoria's fiancé, while genuinely caring and well-intentioned, suffered from a hereditary condition that would likely result in early death and considerable suffering during the final years of their marriage. The couple's love for each other was genuine and deep, but the inevitable tragedy that awaited them would transform their happiness into prolonged grief that would make Victoria's later life a monument to loss and disappointment. The wedding dress that Clara had designed for Victoria's rescue had been her masterpiece of supernatural textile art, incorporating techniques that would preserve not only the bride, but also her fiancé in a realm where their love could exist eternally without being corrupted by illness, death, or the passage of time. The transportation would occur simultaneously for both partners, ensuring that their wedding celebration would continue forever without the separation that mundane mortality would inevitably impose. The ceremony that marked Clara's greatest achievement had taken place in a cathedral filled with distinguished guests who had no conception that they were witnessing the culmination of years of supernatural social work. Victoria and her beloved had exchanged vows with radiant joy that seemed to illuminate the entire sacred space, while their obvious devotion to each other had moved even the most cynical observers to tears of genuine emotion. The moment of transportation had been accomplished with such artistry that the assembled congregation initially believed they were witnessing some form of divine blessing rather than supernatural intervention. The couple had seemed to glow with inner light as they spoke their final vows, their forms becoming increasingly ethereal until they appeared to be made of pure love itself rather than mundane flesh and blood. Victoria's last words had been addressed to the assembled guests rather than to any specific individual. "We go now to a place where love never dies and wedding joy never ends. Do not mourn for us, but celebrate that such perfect happiness is possible for those brave enough to seek it." The simultaneous disappearance of both bride and groom had created a sensation that exceeded even the most dramatic of previous rescue operations, while the obvious love between the transported couple had made their fate seem more like divine rapture than tragic loss. The investigation that followed had been complicated by the complete absence of any evidence suggesting foul play, while witnesses agreed that the couple's final moments had been filled with transcendent joy rather than fear or distress. Clara's success in protecting both partners had represented the ultimate refinement of rescue operations that had begun with saving individual brides from disappointing marriages. The ability to preserve genuine love eternally while preventing the suffering that mortality would inevitably impose had elevated their work beyond mere social intervention to become a form of spiritual ministry that served love itself rather than just protecting romantic dreams. The network that Clara and Vivienne had created would continue expanding indefinitely, with each new practitioner adding to their capability for identifying and rescuing relationships that deserved protection from the corrupting influences of mundane reality. Their work had proven that the most effective forms of social reform were those that transcended the limitations of conventional activism by embracing possibilities that existed beyond ordinary human experience. The wedding dress witch and her devoted apprentice had achieved something unprecedented in human history, a systematic solution to the eternal problem of how to preserve perfect love in a world where all beautiful things eventually faced corruption and decay. Their triumph was complete, their methods undetectable, and their mission eternal, ensuring that romantic dreams would continue to find protection through supernatural intervention that appeared to be nothing more miraculous than exceptionally skilled dressmaking. The final fitting had been completed, the ultimate pattern had been established, and the invisible collection would continue growing forever, each new edition representing another victory of eternal love over temporal disappointment. Madame Vivienne and Clara had created more than a business. They had established a new relationship between dreams and reality that would endure as long as human hearts continued to seek perfect happiness through the dangerous promise of wedding vows.